Hello, and welcome to Stanford Brand's SB Talks podcasts. Today, I'm joined by Stanford Brand Private Wealth Advisor, Kirsten Lin, to talk about our recent white paper on balancing your retirement and the needs of your adult children. Welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
In approaching this topic with clients, is it fair to say the first thing that you prioritize is balancing the needs of their retirement and making sure that they've adequately provided for themselves?
I think that's a really important point to start on. Absolutely. What I guess I found in talking to clients over time is that they often come in and really want to talk about the solutions. So they're particularly worried about their children and how to help them get into the property market. And I feel like it's helpful to take a step back and think about two things particularly before we get to a solution. I guess the first one is what they can afford to do and how it fits with their own needs, and then also how it fits with what they actually want to achieve and their own philosophy about giving.
How often do you face scenarios where clients are seeking to be more generous and you're having to almost take them through some of the risks and the pitfalls of what they intend to do in terms of not allowing for themselves?
I guess it's absolutely a mix of both. The main one that I've found when I'm talking to people about passing on wealth to their children is really about aged care. So when people are thinking about their retirement, one of the things that I talk to people about is how they're planning for aging. And it almost to a person, I think nobody has said to me that they really want to go into residential aged care. So what often I find though is that there's a worry lurking just at the back of their minds about what would it look like if I absolutely had to go into aged care, and how much would it cost? And I think one of the great things that I can do as an advisor is go through what that might look like, and to be able to take that worry away as one of the parts of planning, so that either allows you to be able to think, well, I can afford to give more money to my children, or I do need to set that aside. But it's also just, I guess to me, that sort of planning, which is one of the things that I think you need to look at first in thinking about your own retirement, is a bit like insurance in that when we're talking with young professionals about how they need to have a plan B when they're building their wealth, I think it's very similar when you're in your retirement to think about a plan B if you absolutely had to go into residential care, and even if you didn't want to, you would have the peace of mind of knowing that there was a plan in place. So that's part of the planning that I think is a really good foundation before you get into talking about this more detailed.
Yeah, and your white paper sets out very well the overlap between some of those plans for aging and estate planning issues, powers of attorney, things of that nature. Do you mind elaborating a bit further on some of the discussions you would have with clients and trying to make sure they've made appropriate provisions on that front?
I think, we talk to everybody about making sure not just when they're thinking about estate planning, that they're thinking about what happens with their estate, but also thinking about things that happen during their lifetime and the person that or people that they'd like to appoint, both to look after their finances, but also to look after health and medical decisions if those need to be made. And then I guess it also fits in with that idea of succession planning and who's going to look after things for you down the track.
And is it fair to say that in your work with different family groups, often one of the most challenging aspects is who to appoint, both in terms of financial controls and also health-related controls, should their situation deteriorate?
I think one of the points that is really helpful to understand is the family dynamics, because it plays into so many different areas. So it plays into the question of how parents want to help their children, but again, it also plays into what you're talking about there. So it could be that, I often see families where they're concerned about one particular child. So that particular child might not be the child that they necessarily want to leave in charge of their finances or end of life decisions, for example, but they want to take care of that child. But then also you see another dynamic that's also going on there where the parents don't want to treat any of their children differently. So it's
Mm.
really important to be having these conversations and to understand what the risks and also what the benefits are so that people can make an informed decision. And you see that then playing out in how you do your estate planning and your succession planning, and how you do gifts during your lifetime, and then who you leave in charge of looking after things.
And have you encountered many occasions, scenarios where even a couple in a standard family unit can't even quite agree on who potentially is the most appropriate person to leave in charge?
I think particularly when it's not an obvious situation. So I guess when you're sort of a young professional, you might be looking to your parents, or once your children are getting older, it might begin to be obvious that it's passed to the children. But particularly when the children are sort of in their 20s and 30s, it can be a really difficult decision. Do you look for a family friend? Perhaps your own parents are in their 70s and 80s, and probably at the point where they're not the right decision maker anymore. Do you appoint a sibling? Whose sibling do you appoint? So it's a really important process to work through, and not everyone will have the same view, and you've got to come to, I guess, a compromise that people are happy to settle with.
Yes. And once you're able to address the challenges of making sure that the family is adequately provided for themselves, then you're able to move forward to what you describe in the white paper as the bigger picture considerations, almost more philosophical type objectives in terms of, yes, we've got enough money to pass it on and potentially pass it on now, but do we want to? How do you typically approach those discussions with your clients?
I think by asking a lot of questions to look a bit behind the thinking of where they're trying to get to. So as I said before, it's very common for someone to come in and say, look, we're really worried about our children being able to get into the property market. And this is about taking a step back and saying, okay, what's going to be important to you? What's important to them? Because what can be a sticking point here is that your very well-intentioned gift doesn't have the impact or isn't received in the way that you want it to. So in the white paper, I had, I guess, 4 areas that I said are really useful to look at. And I've got a bunch of questions that I go through, but if you broadly group them, one of them is, I guess, the foundations. So that's about you and your attitudes and beliefs about money. Very often that comes from how you were raised and what you experienced as a child and what your parents did. Another is the story of your wealth. So how you accrued the wealth, whether it's family wealth, whether you built it yourself, what the legacy is that you'd like to leave with that wealth. Then the next one is that you've got to think about your children and the particular situations of your children. So, is there a child you want to help more than others because of their particular circumstances? How do the children get on? Can you leave them with one entity that they look after together, or do they need separate entities? And then the fourth is the transitions, or the possible transitions that you could go through. So you can look at, giving them assistance during your lifetime, or perhaps you could get them involved in managing your financial affairs during your lifetime, or you can give more significant gifts, so actually passing on your wealth rather than specifically to help the children, but just to pass on the wealth during your lifetime. And then finally, passing on wealth in your estate.
And I think as you set that out there, you talk about a whole variety or a spectrum of scenarios where different families may choose the right point in terms of, one, how much information to share, and then two, how much financial assistance to provide to their children, and a common theme there with providing enough help to help them get started in life, but not so much as to provide a disincentive to kicking on in life themselves.
Yeah. That's pretty common, I would have said. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And how often are you finding that families want to bring the children in to have a more broader family discussion around that intergenerational wealth piece? And it might be not so much that here's the money today, but this is what our family philosophy is with regard to the money, and this is what our plan is in terms of passing it on either during our lifetime or beyond.
It can be quite a range, and there are really differing views here. And I've spoken to quite a lot of estate planners, and some of them will say to you, look, you should never share information about your wealth with your children, and others will say, yes, you should share all the information. So everyone will have a very different view on this. And so I see everything from parents saying, it'd be really great if you talk to our children about insurance, or it'd be really great if you ran my 20-year-old child through how investing works, what are exchange traded funds and where do they fit in, and how do you buy on the stock exchange, and how do you make these decisions, all the way through to getting children involved in decision making. And then of course I have clients who the children are acting as the enduring powers of attorney, or powers of attorney, and making decisions for the parents.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you refer there to the school of thought in terms of minimizing the amount of information sharing for the protection of the broader family. But is it fair to suggest that some of the less positive scenarios that we've seen and handled is often because the information wasn't shared in any way, shape, or form, and sometimes can lead to conflict after the fact because the parents' wishes or their values weren't probably articulated while they were still around?
That's absolutely the case. You certainly, I guess you're in the position where you can share information and have discussions with your family.
Whether they like it or not, you're at least in the position
whether they like it or not, but also in order to explain what your thinking is and why you've come to those decisions. And it's quite a common thing now to see, certainly among the very, very wealthy, for people to be putting it out there that they don't intend to leave all their wealth to their children, and here's what we're going to do. But I certainly have many clients who talk to their children about what they're intending to do, and what you might expect might not be what you receive back from the children. So it's not. I certainly haven't found it particularly common that children have said, "Oh no, you should be saving everything for me." I've certainly had many clients come back to me and say, we've talked to our children and they've said, spend it all on yourselves. And so if you have those sorts of discussions, you're more likely to, I would have thought, avoid, I guess, the rupture to family bonds that you could have down the end. But again, as I said, it depends on the family.
It's interesting you described that, in the children coming back and saying, spend more on yourselves, almost particularly given the baby boomer generation, there might be a certain amount of guilt that they need to sort of squirrel away as much as possible for the next generation, where their children might certainly not share that philosophy. They might be, well, you've worked hard all your lives, enjoy it, look after yourselves. And we're sure there'll be some left behind and there'll be a family home and other things, but look after yourselves first and foremost.
Yeah, particularly the family home. And that's one of the reasons that one of the things we do up front, so before talking about the big picture, is to have a look at what the asset base is and do some modeling and talk about scenarios and say, well, this is the amount you're likely to have left. Is this enough to leave to your children? How much did you want to leave? Because here are your options, and here's what you might end up with. And it gives just a more informed way of understanding that, in fact, with the value of homes in capital cities in Australia, you're probably leaving more than you thought you were, or perhaps more than you received yourself.
Excellent. So moving on then from the philosophical arguments, moving on a bit more towards the nuts and bolts, what are you finding are the most common scenarios that you are working with clients on in terms of the assistance that they want to provide to their children, particularly while they're still around?
I guess the most common one that people come in with and people want to talk about is property. So it can be quite a range. It could be just helping a young professional child into the property market, or it could be helping a particular child. So I've had a number of clients where I've been helping with looking after a particular child by buying a property in the parent's name that the child will then live in and might pass to the child in the parent's estate.
Do you mind just pausing on that for a second? So, in different scenarios, why would family groups maybe consider putting it in the parent's name as opposed to passing it down to the children straight away? What would be some of the advantages of doing that?
This is more a situation where you're trying to protect the child so that the child can't, I guess, get a mortgage over the property. There are other ways of looking at it, but this tends to be the most simple. But there's certainly, in each of those scenarios, we've gone through a range of different ownership structures, and that's the way that we've ended up deciding for those particular families.
Very good. And other, you set out in the white paper other things like buying multi-generational properties, or even the scenarios where you're buying a property or the guarantorship routes.
I've had a few clients who've bought multi-generational properties, so that could be buying in one party's name, but the other party could have made a loan or could have some sort of residency right within the property. I won't go into the detail of that there, but there's a lot that goes in the background there. And one of the really important parts of that in particular, and in fact, any of these, is to get a lawyer involved and make sure that everything is documented. And I would say that about pretty much most of the things we're about to talk about now.
So are you talking about loan type arrangements there, or something much broader than that?
Could be loan type arrangements, could be having rights that are passed down in some sort of documented fashions, or right of residency is one example.
Yeah. Outside of property being probably the area that's about 80% plus of the queries or the priorities, what other areas are you finding that intergenerational work is that you are doing with your clients?
One I really encourage clients to look at is getting either financial advice or insurance advice for their children, or estate planning advice for their children. It's just something that people in their 20s or 30s or even 40s might not choose to spend money on. Maybe they're paying for mortgages and all that sort of thing. It's just not front of mind. But you often find that the parent is the person who's going to be the backstop or the safety net. If something happens to their child and they lose a job or there's a marriage breakdown, the parent is going to be the one stepping in. And so it's really
the parents
helpful.
End up being the insurance policy.
Absolutely. So there's a real incentive there. It'll not only help for the independence, but it's also just great for protecting their own potential retirement and the impact it might have. But it can help to set their children on a great path with making good decisions about where and how and when to buy property, and putting money into superannuation, things that they might not otherwise have thought about, or not thought about where they might fit in their planning or priorities.
So working from property through to some of the more technical aspects, you also set out in the white paper, quite interestingly, a few less financial related ways that the parents could think about actually having substantial contribution to their children's lives. And do you mind walking us through a couple of those?
I thought one of the things that perhaps is undervalued by people who are coming to talk about, how can we help our children into property, is perhaps what seems like a non-financial contribution. So if you're a grandparent who's looking after grandkids during the school holidays, or is paying for school fees, but even more than that, who's picking children up from school, teaching them how to do maths, sharing some sort of interest with them. It could be art or music or kicking a football around. That might not have a financial value to you, but a parent in that situation, your child, might not be paying for after school care, and might not be paying for vacation care, and at the same time you get a lovely relationship with your grandchild.
A huge peace of mind value as well, in terms of just helping the parents balance the competing needs of their world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I certainly wouldn't underestimate that, and I certainly would think it's important when you're thinking about it to realize that you may already be giving far more than you had thought of.
And even something as simple as shared valued experience. So you talk about the holiday type scenario, but possibly going, it might be to the opera or the ballet or whatever, things of that nature that all contribute to the sort of the tapestry of passing on sort of family values down to the next generation.
Absolutely. Those are things that your children and particularly your grandchildren will remember, that they spent summers with you up at the farm, or that you all went to the holiday houses together. These are things that perhaps the parents might not be in a position to prioritize at the moment, depending on where they're at financially. And it's a lovely gift that you can also be part of. So, you know, it's, while helping into property is one great option, it's just not the only one. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it would be helpful to share in this paper all the breadth of different things to think about, but also that you might have as options once you've thought about what's important to you and what's important to your children, and whether you can afford to help.
So many of the listeners to the podcast will be at a stage where they haven't really started to explore this topic in greater detail. They're possibly starting to ask themselves the questions of, one, is this something we can afford to do? And two, what's right for us and what's right for our family? What are the key themes or the key overarching messages that you would like to communicate on that?
I guess the three things are, it's important to understand where you're at financially and what capacity you have to put funds towards this goal. So sit down and with your financial advisor and understand your capacity to do that, some modeling, that sort of thing. The next is to actually sit down and think about what's important to you and what's important to your children. So what I mentioned before about making sure that your very well-intentioned gift lands in the way that you want. It's, you know, not uncommon for you to be thinking you're giving this wonderful gift that your child could use to pay off a mortgage, and they're using it to, you know, go on a holiday overseas, not at the moment, but at a normal time. And it's important to understand how you're going to feel about that, because this is meant to be a wonderful experience that you and they get something out of. So make sure that you've got aligned values in that. And then explore the myriad of options that are out there and available. You don't just need to do one. You might do, you know, some combination, or you might realize that you're already doing more than you realized you were doing.
Yeah, but certainly talk to your advisor, understand what the options are, and we're always here to help. Excellent. Thank you very much, Kirsten. That's a beautiful overview. For any of the listeners that haven't read it yet, I encourage you to pick up Kirsten's white paper. It's on the Stanford Brown website under the intelligence section, and certainly much more to follow in this space over the years to come. This is certainly an area where client queries and advice needs are growing, and the need to plan appropriately and communicate is ever increasing, just to make sure you get the right outcome for you, for your family, and your legacy. But thank you very much, Kirsten, and thank you to all our listeners.
Thank you.